Yoo-hoo!
Hello and welcome to a first virtual book launch that I am hosting. Now, don't be puzzled, you are at the right event. In case you were looking through that title sequence and thinking, which one of those was Donald Trump? He wasn't dressed as a Morris dancer, is my tip. But you are going to hear about Mr. Trump, you're going to hear about Boris Johnson, you're going to hear about, COVID and Brexit as well, because the whole point of what you're about to hear for the next hour is about how those individuals, how those extraordinary issues, how these extraordinary times have affected my trade and the trade of some big names that you're going to hear from over the next 59 minutes or so. What has it done to our journalism? Because, of course, there is a big new book being launched by a team that refers to themselves as academics. You sort of know what they mean, don't you? They're journalists who become academics, who therefore know how it's done, and they've got track record. Many of you, I suspect, listening to this call may either have contributed to or purchased and studied and talked about the previous book, Media, Brexit, Boris and the Media. This one is Populism and the Media, and it's published by Abramis. It's available in Kindle and paperback versions on Amazon. Not quite yet, but very soon. And it's going to be available in an ebook format through Routledge worldwide soon as well. Now, in case you like to measure the size, the quality of a book through its size, I am told to tell you, it feels very boosterish, very Johnsonian this. It has 44 chapters and therefore must be a bloody good thing. But the key thing is who has written those chapters. I wrote an introduction, but the people you're about to hear from all made their contributions. Amongst them, some of the stars of British journalism, Robert Moore of ITV News, the only TV reporter at the storming of the Capitol in January. If you haven't watched the documentary of Robert's extraordinary report, if you can still watch it, he'll tell us. It is well worth watching. It is a gripping watch. Matt Frei, we hope, will be joining us. He's not with us just yet because, small point, he's about to present an edition of Channel 4 News. If he can, he will pop in to us. The Deborah Bonetti is here. She heads the Foreign Press Association in London. And also here is Dorothy Byrne, who was head of news and current affairs and editor-at-large at Channel 4, and shockingly chose to quit after 17 years in the job. There was, of course, no connection with her giving a major speech at Edinburgh, referring to Boris Johnson as a liar. He has long tentacles, but not quite that long. But before we hear from all of those, we're going to first of all hear from our favourite poll watcher, psephologist, election room reader, Professor Sir John Curtice of the University of Strathclyde, who can kick us off. Over to you, John.
Hi, Nick. What I want to look at is really, I guess, to challenge what, at least until recently, has been quite a common Westminster folk wisdom, which is that now that the United Kingdom has not only left the European Union, but has also exited its single market, and therefore Brexit has largely, for the most part, gone off the media headlines, that therefore politically it's becoming an irrelevance, not least perhaps because those on the Remain side of the argument realise that the game is up. So let me just walk you through a little of this, basically looking at some of the polling evidence of the last couple of years or so since the UK left the European Union at the end of January 2020. It is looking, first of all, broken over two periods. The levels of support for being inside or outside the European Union, as measured by opinion polls, but as measured by two slightly different questions, and perhaps potentially crucially different questions. One is that polls that ask people whether or not we should remain or leave. So it's the question that was asked in 2016. But of course, since January 2020, and certainly since the end of last year, that's no longer the question that would face the United Kingdom. The question it would face is whether it wanted to rejoin or to stay out of the European Union. I've broken this down into two time periods. The blue shows the data until the free trade agreement was unveiled on Christmas Eve 2020, and then the orange shows the position since then. You'll notice, first of all, not much change. You will see that in the first period, 52% remain, 48% leave. This, by the way, is pretty much in line with the position at the time of the general election. Then the polls were showing 53% remain, 47% leave. It's eased a little, but we're still looking at a country divided down the middle on the question that it was asked back in June 2016, 50%, 50%. Ask people whether or not we should rejoin or stay out. You get a slightly different balance. There are indeed some people who would still vote Remain, who would not necessarily now vote to rejoin the European Union, but they're very much a minority of those on the Remain side of the argument. And as you can see, irrespective of the time period we're looking at, it's 48% for rejoining, 52% for stay out. That, of course, replicates the result of the 2016 EU referendum. So the first thing one has to say, the idea that those on the Remain side of the argument have given up the ghost and feel that the issue is over, certainly on this evidence, is not substantiated. We're still looking at a country which is as divided over Brexit as it has been at any point during the last 5 years. You might, of course, be asking yourself, well, why is that possible given everything that's happened? Including, of course, the fact that Mr. Johnson has unveiled a free trade agreement on Christmas Eve 2020. Well, here's a pretty strong clue. These are how people evaluated Mr. Johnson's free trade deal in polls conducted immediately after its unveiling. And of course, what you discover is that Remain voters are inclined to the view that it's a bad deal. Leave voters are inclined to the view that it's a good deal. And the truth is that throughout the course of the last 5 years, basically Remain voters have been looking at what's been happening through one set of coloured glasses and Leave voters through another. Now, that said, you might still be saying, well, but hang on, maybe do people necessarily feel quite so intently about Brexit as they did? And certainly one of the things that we've been charting at the National Centre for Social Research for the last 2 or 3 years is how asking people basically that question that's become part of our political lexicon: are you a Remainer or a Leaver? And then having asked that, we say, well, are you a very strong Remainer stroke Leaver, fairly strong, not very strong? A question, by the way, that we've been asking about political parties ever since the 1960s. The blue line is the proportion who say very strong. It has been running at well above 40%. It has eased back a little. So we're perhaps not quite so intensely attached to the two sides as we once were, certainly during the height of the Brexit debate. But if I then go on and tell you that no more than 10% of people feel very strongly Conservative, very strong Labour or whatever, you will see still how this argument, this debate, actually still captures the emotions and the views of voters to a greater extent than which political party they support. So what's been happening to party support in the wake of all of this? And is there any sign that the Brexit divide, which of course reshaped the character of the support for our political parties between 2015 and 2019, the Conservative vote in particular becoming very concentrated amongst Leave voters, Labour, relatively speaking, amongst Remain voters? Well, of course, quite a lot has happened during the course of the last 12 months in the wake of the pandemic. Support for the parties has gone up and gone down, as indeed has people's evaluations of how well the government is handling the pandemic. The grey here on the third line in all these trios is indeed people's evaluation of how well the government's handling the pandemic. It was very high in the early stage of the pandemic. It fell pretty rapidly. It got very low last autumn, and it's now well back up again in the wake of the vaccination success. In the wake of that, Conservative support, broadly speaking, went down. It was at its lowest in the autumn. That's when Labour was at its strongest, and it's pretty much come back up again more recently. So certainly we've been looking at changes in the level of the support for the parties. But does this mean we've been seeing a change in the structure of support? Well, this is the level of support for the Conservatives in the polls at various stages in the course of the last 12 months. July 2020, when the Conservatives were still 6 points ahead. October, when it was even Stevens. March, and then most recently in the wake of the local elections. Well, it's the Conservatives who were getting the three-quarters of support of 2016 Leave voters in 2019. It's not quite so high now, but they still dominate the support of Leave voters. They're equally, therefore, very dependent on the support of Leave voters. Labour's efforts to reconnect in the jargon of Leave voters, frankly, have not got very far. And on the Remain side of the argument, well, the Conservatives certainly hanging on to the Remain support, maybe reconnected with a little bit of it. But Labour still very, very heavily dependent on the support of Remain voters, though it is amongst Remain voters that Labour has lost ground more recently. The Liberal Democrats have indeed, all they've managed to do in the last 12 months is to lose the ground, the support amongst Remain voters that they had in 2019. They're pretty much back down to where they were in 2015 amongst that group. But, you can still see how very, very much how the support for the parties is still structured by Brexit, which is why nobody should have been surprised when in the local elections at the beginning of May, the Conservatives did well in Remain Britain, and not so well, did well in Leave Britain, not so well in Remain Britain. And of course, we've also had two by-elections, one in Remain Britain, one in Leave Britain, which came up with very, very different results. So Brexit is still very much with us.
John, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us if you would. Fascinating that. We're going to bring you back in our discussions if you're able to stay with us about both Boris Johnson, of course, but even perhaps with Donald Trump, because it's to him we now turn. He is, if you like, the best known populist. Populism is one of the words, the crucial word in the title of this book, just in case you were forgetting. He left office and had a not entirely successful January the 6th, an extraordinary day in history, a frightening day in history for Democrats, a day in history that forever and a day, Robert Moore, ITV News, will be remembered for. The best first-hand reporting you can do. And Robert, in a sense for you, it was a culmination of years of reporting in the United States and having to work out how the rules of journalism are altered when you have a president who says the media are liars, supporters who not just believe the media are liars, but in fact want to lynch members of the media for that reason. Give us a glimpse, as you describe some of the events you lived through, of what a challenge it was for you as a journalist doing your job.
Well, thanks, Nick, and to my fellow contributors here and to those who helped write this fascinating book. Yes, January the 6th was an extraordinary day, and the thesis of my chapter, and very much the thought that I'm left with some months afterwards, is a little sort of controversial in this sense that although famously January the 6th exposed sort of some of the fault lines in American society, and most obviously sort of failures in law enforcement, intelligence gathering, and in the kind of the perception of what the danger was out there. My argument is also that the January the 6th became a template in how not to cover populism and a dramatic unfolding news event. For this reason, really, Nick, yes, it was a nice scoop for me to be there, kind of embedded in the crowd and kind of startlingly rather alone compared to where other journalists were. But what really is my takeaway is, why was I alone? Where was the American media? Where were the television crews alongside me? And what I have kind of recognized, and I think what many American television journalists recognize as well, is it actually is an insight into why this story of January the 6th is also a television news failure? And the answer is, across all of the networks, people were basically engaged in panel discussions of the day. And what January the 6th really was, it illustrated how American television has largely, on the domestic scene, abandoned news gathering in favor of these partisan panel discussions that have taken over American television news coverage. So, even as the events were unfolding, even though they were within sight and sound of the Capitol, the American television networks were all debating what was happening. They weren't actually kind of listening to the insurrectionists in real time. So, why was it that I knew that something was unfolding in the hours before January the 6th, but nobody else appeared to have that clarity? And the answer is because they were all in studios, and ITV News and a few other networks as well, mainly foreign networks, were out there on the ellipse, on the National Mall, listening to what people were going to do. And they were telling us, we are going to storm Congress. And so it was a pretty obvious sort of journalistic next step to reposition ourselves on that side of the Capitol and to go in to Congress with the mob in real time. But the proudest, I think, moment for ITV News is not what we did on January the 6th, but again, it was about news gathering some months earlier when we could see that white militias and white supremacists had been empowered and they were beginning to emerge from the darkness, and they'd been empowered and emboldened by Donald Trump, and they were trying to make their statement. And so my argument in the chapter that I have written is that the American media coverage of Donald Trump, and in particular of January the 6th, was almost a template in how not to cover populism. In other words, the coverage was reduced to sort of studio debate and not news gathering. So it is no surprise to me that Americans feel that the television, cable TV news is not listening to them, that they feel that they've never covered adequately the dislocation in the Midwest of their economies, or they haven't adequately covered homelessness or the opioid addiction, or indeed what their grievances have been in recent years. So I take away from January the 6th, not that it was a nice scoop for me, though perhaps it was, but rather that it was a template on how not to cover a populist movement in real time. And that's my thought, Nick.
And Robert, just before I bring in others to discuss that, just briefly, if you would, is your view about why that happened was because the American media weren't willing to spend the money, or because the skills no longer exist, or because they do exist, the big guys are not the people with those skills and the junior guys can't get themselves on screen? In other words, or is it simply they think talking heads is what sells ads, so let's stick with the talking heads?
Yeah, I think talking heads is a easy and cheap form of television. News gathering, much more challenging, much more difficult. And I think it's that failure of the Americans to news gather in their own country. And there's an irony here, is they do some spectacularly strong news gathering overseas, but they weren't listening at home. And that's why I think, it's astonishing to me that January 6th came as a surprise. It really wasn't a surprise. I mean, anybody who was listening could see that there were these empowered forces, right-wing, certainly inflamed by conspiracy theories and white supremacist thinking that had been empowered by the White House. But essentially, yes, I mean, I think what the perception was from television executives is if you grab a partisan and polarizing group in a studio, that is a magnet for viewers, and people want to sort of listen to that. But it's a failure of our very sort of journalistic DNA to think that news is produced or analysed best in a studio and not in the field.
Robert, that's fascinating. I think Matt Frei can't join us just yet, so I'm going to bring in instead Dorothy Byrne, and then he is there. Matt, hello. Were you hearing that? What a joy to see you there from the Channel 4 studio. Let me see if we can hear you. Did you hear Robert's suggestion that essentially that the coverage of January the 6th reflected a failing in the American media that you know terribly well, that they're obsessed with studios where you are now and I am normally, and not obsessed with day-to-day reporting? You're on mute, Matt.
I'm on mute. Can we be unmuted? Can you hear me now, Nick?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
So I've talked to a number of television executives, both here and on the other side of the pond, and they were astonished by the fact, and actually really quite annoyed by the fact, that there were none of their own correspondents doing what Robert did. And it's partly that, they might not have had the contact. It's partly that, the big wigs in Washington maybe thought they were too grand to scramble up those walls and join the barbarians storming the Capitol. But also, they were too busy, especially on the cable channels, talking about something, analyzing, opining about something that was happening. And that is very much the case when you watch American cable TV, both on the left and the right. They are singing to their own gallery, because that is the business model that works. It's not about questioning your own assumptions, ever. It's about, preaching to the choir, singing to the chorus, and, the advertisers like it. They know exactly who they're advertising to. You get the, people on, paying their cable subscriptions. It's a double revenue stream. It works financially. It makes them lorry loads of money. It's just not very good for democracy. Sorry, now you're mute.
My fault.
Okay.
My fault. Here we go.
You're on again.
The big debate that also took place in the American media between different TV networks, but between different newspapers as well, was how to treat Trump the populist. Did you, on the one hand, as the New York Times and CNN did, call him a liar and put it up in lights? Did you, as a British editor, Jerry Baker of the Wall Street Journal, did originally say, no, we're not going to do that. We won't make that judgment. What view did you come to about the best way for journalists through this?
Well, obviously, ideally what you do is you include him in the debate. You don't try and exclude him as some people did when he was running for president. I remember the disbelief amongst my friends in Washington and New York and in London that this guy might actually get the nomination, let alone win the White House. They just refused to accept it. They kept saying to me, look at the data, Matt, look at the data. The data says that no one like that under these circumstances, with the economy where it is at the moment, after 8 years of Obama, could ever win an election. It's just not going to happen. And my experience from the field, going to Trump rallies, almost too many of them, but they were fascinating things to behold, was that actually there was a coalition of not just the left behind, but people who were waging their private wars against, political correctness, against woke culture, people who were upset with New York or Washington for one reason or another, rich and poor, but predominantly white, it has to be said, who were prepared to vote for Donald Trump. And the last time that I saw that kind of blind faith in a new politician, before Trump, when he was running in 2016, was in 2008 for a guy called Barack Obama. And so my gut was telling me that he would win, and my head was telling me that it was impossible. And frankly, Nick, I didn't know which organ to trust. But clearly he had something, but it was never taken seriously by the networks. And here's an interesting little aside. So MSNBC has this show called Morning Joe, which is incredibly popular. It really broadcasts in a kind of fairly unashamed way to the metropolitan elites, on both coasts, but also bits in the middle. Places like Austin, Texas, which are it's like a mini San Francisco in the middle of Texas. And they loved having Trump on all the time when, even at the beginning when he started his campaign, because he was great for ratings and they could never get him off the phone. Trump was like an interview machine, an interview mill, constantly talking. And then but they never questioned him about some of the stuff that he was saying. And then at some stage they decided to drop him altogether. But, you've got to do both. You have these people on, don't exclude them, but ask the right questions.
Fascinating. Matt, thank you for taking the time just before you go on air. Much appreciated. Let me bring in Dorothy Byrne. We'll talk to you, Dorothy, in a second about Brexit and some of the things you said about Boris Johnson. I want you to comment on that and whether we're really in a position to kind of lecture the American media, or are we not guilty of precisely that? We're addicted and were addicted to Trump's appearances on social media. I know on my own program, there was a sort of, God, he's left Twitter. What are we going to do now when we get up at 4:15 in the morning? And were we not also guilty of too much studio chat and not enough frontline reporting?
I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that we perhaps covered Trump almost too much and treated him like he was a bit of political entertainment and didn't see him as a threat to democracy sufficiently.
Okay, let me see if Deborah is there. Deborah Bonetti, are you there? And do you share that view?
I am here, and I was listening really carefully to what both Robert and Matt were saying, and of course Dorothy. And I think that maybe if and seeing this as a foreign journalist based here, I wonder whether there's a parallel that we could draw between the way that the American media were not seeing what was happening, we're not aware of really what was happening, we're not talking to the same contacts that Robert was talking to, and the Westminster bubble, and how this ushered in maybe Brexit, the fact that they were completely separate from what goes on outside of Westminster, but also outside of London. It's what many of us kind of thought when Brexit happened. So I just wondered whether, you know, that made any sense with what you're talking about, because I'm sure that the American media is very well informed of what's going on there on the ground. They just seem to be in a bubble, which I kind of see here as well.
Well, it's fascinating, and you've given us a perfect excuse, a perfect segue to another section of this book, another section of our conversation, which is to turn from Trump to the man he called Britain Trump, to Boris Johnson, who I have to say, and Dorothy Byrne will no doubt laugh at this, reflects my too many years and decades at the BBC, hesitate to call a populist, because the word populist is so obviously used in a pejorative way. But let's, for the purposes of this conversation, not have an argument about that and say he was a populist, at least in the way that he surfed the wave on Brexit. And it seemed to me that Matt Frei's description of that conflict between head and gut in terms of journalism perfectly describes what someone who'd spent so long in the Westminster lobby, someone like me, felt. A kind of analysis of certain polling data of what was going on, and yet a gut telling me there's something on the move. And in the end, I made the mistake of trusting head and not trusting gut when it came to Brexit. Dorothy Byrne gave an important lecture about the coverage of Boris Johnson. Important in particular, Dorothy, because you chose, as I alluded to earlier, you chose in your McTaggart lecture to be absolutely clear that you saw Boris Johnson as a liar and felt that the media should call him a liar. Very similar debate to the one I alluded to earlier between the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, between CNN, for example, Fox News and others. Just take us on that journey of why you did that and why, in a sense, you think that should shape the way journalism is done when it comes to populists.
I think that British broadcasters are too polite with Boris Johnson and a range of politicians in not stating when they tell lies. And there's a particular problem in British broadcasting with the way in which due impartiality is used or misused, I'm afraid, by journalists, in that a lot of television and radio journalists think it's their job to say, on the one hand, the politicians have said this, on the other hand, various commentators and other politicians say that, and they don't say one group there is telling a lie. And sometimes they are telling a lie, and if we don't tell the viewers what are lies and what are truth, they don't know. And I've often quoted a major piece of research that Channel 4 News did, where we showed 6 stories to 1,700 people, and only 4% could tell which stories were true and which stories were false. And our politicians, Boris Johnson is only one, have been using this abuse of the concept of due impartiality to get equal play for their lies and truth. And I think that journalists have got to stop saying that the lies of politicians are equivalent to established fact.
I wonder what Robert Moore, listening to that in the United States, knowing that the American media had a journey away from impartiality when they dropped lots of the regulations in the Reagan era that had enforced TV impartiality and led, therefore, over a number of years to Fox News. What do you make when you hear what Dorothy's saying in terms of the coverage of British politics?
No, I think it's a good point that Dorothy makes. And the sort of amplification of the problem here is that there is a loss of distinction between what is news and what is opinion. The secret sauce of cable television news here is that when it gets to prime time after about 5 p.m., we get these extraordinarily highly opinionated TV shows that suddenly come on air, whether it's, Rachel Maddow on the left, whether it's Tucker Carlson on the right. And suddenly, the sort of drumbeat of sort of really quite toxic and partisan sort of coverage begins all over again in this 24-hour news cycle. And there's a complete lack of clarity about the distinguishing line between news and opinion. And so, whilst it is true that there has been this kind of 4-year-long kind of anguished debate about how we should categorize and how we should call out Donald Trump, there has also been this colossal media failure to try and keep a dividing line, a bright red dividing line between news as we genuinely see it and opinion as these TV executives think will sell their viewers, just like Matt Frei was saying.
I think that's the fascinating challenge. If I put back to Dorothy Byrne, and then I'm going to bring in Deborah on that, which is if you were to go down the route you're saying, Dorothy, and this is what makes me, as someone from the BBC stable, hesitant, how do you avoid the temptation for it to be the definition of your program as the program that calls politician A or B or liar? So that, in other words, let's say it's Channel 4 News, but it could be any news organisation, says, well, today we're looking for Boris Johnson's latest lie. Let's do that. And that becomes the fun, not the reporting, the labelling.
I don't think that we should use the term lie very often. We shouldn't throw it about. But I think every now and then we have to call out the lies and a particular reason. Maybe don't use the word lie, maybe use a slightly more polite word. But every now and then we have to do that because politicians in Britain are no longer putting themselves up for in-depth interviews in which we can really analyse the truth and falsity of what they say. They either don't appear at all or appear so briefly that they can't be held to account.
Now, Deborah Bonetti, let me bring you in with your perspective from the Foreign Press Association. Just before I do that, I'm going to check whether Matt Frei is still with us, because he may have had to go, and I suspect he had to get on air. So I'm going to assume he's no longer available to us. But Deborah, what do you make of this debate with your perspective as a journalist for Italian media, as chair of the Foreign Press Association, and therefore seeing how the foreign media have reported on Boris Johnson and reported on Brexit as well, as to whether you think what Dorothy Byrne is suggesting of a greater clarity about what is true and what is false would help our reporting?
I do agree with Dorothy. I do think that the coverage in this country of Brexit and of, let's say, the ascent of Boris Johnson to his current job has been very different to the way certainly the European media has been covering Brexit and Boris as well. And Brexit in itself was built on a lot of lies, and I think that the British media could have done more to explain things and to highlight the things that were palpable lies. It seems to have been done too late. It seems that maybe even though in particular the BBC has been accused of being too partisan in so many ways, by the way, not just against the government, but even pro the government. Nobody seems to be happy with it at the moment. it could have done a lot more without necessarily becoming what Robert was saying, you know, this partisan opinion journalism, and, you know, that nobody really needs, because that's not how you find out what's actually happening. If only during the Brexit debate and ahead of the referendum, things had been explained properly, and questions had been constantly asked and myths debunked, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in now, I think.
I think that's an interesting contention. I'm not sure whether John Curtice is still with us to reflect on that, but I think it's a fascinating contention to suggest that that in itself would have been enough. What view did you take, Robert, in the United States, where you must have heard people in the liberal media, let's use it in a loose sense, people at the New York Times, people at the CNN, who would have said, if only we'd said X or Y, Donald Trump wouldn't have existed? I have to say, I'm not convinced.
No, I think, look, I think even the liberal kind of media beltway establishment recognized that just like they misread January the 6th, so they misread the rise of Donald Trump, misread his campaign, thought that these extraordinary rallies that we were all witnesses to were just kind of some sort of phenomenon that didn't represent real Americans, that when it came to voting, that they would, of course, vote for Hillary Clinton. So, I mean, I think it's another sort of historic kind of misreading of the mood. And it's one that, you know, I think the American television networks once again failed to identify what was going on. There was this misreporting of kind of the heartland. And, you know, looking back on it now, you can see, you know, the seismic sort of signs that Trump was gaining traction to an extraordinary extent in key battleground states in the Midwest. So yes, I mean, I think it's another illustration and a warning sign of how we report on populist events like January the 6th, but also the rise of Donald Trump, and in the UK on the rise of a Leave faction that became the winning party in Brexit. So all of these are big questions, and that's why the book is so valuable. We don't just need to sort of news gather on the front line. We need to think, step back a little bit. That's why the role of people like John Curtice is so important. We need to stop and think about how we do this in a way that those on the front lines haven't got time always to do. You know, on January the 6th, I didn't have time to analyze the nature of the mob. All I could do was try and be kind of an eyewitness and realize that the best reporting we could do would be kind of fly on the wall. It was sort of real-time interviews with insurrectionists as they were storming the Capitol. I couldn't possibly, in those moments, try and take stock of the implications, the ramifications of January the 6th. And that's why I think a book like this and a debate like this is valuable, because it allows us to, as you put it, you know, hacks and academics to actually come together and ponder how we do better in the future.
Dorothy, I mean, Channel 4 News did invest a huge amount in frontline journalism, and arguably some of the failings that Robert's described were true, as Deborah suggested, of the British media, not in the months before Brexit, but in years. I mean, I made a documentary for the BBC called The Truth About Immigration, and the truth is, in newsrooms around London, when William Hague was talking about people's worries about asylum seekers, the common view was that it was a dog whistle to racists. The view now is that he was onto something. And but I would suggest to you that precisely because there wasn't enough frontline reporting of the sort that Robert's described, the media in their newsrooms in London missed that and got it wrong.
I think that the media has been too London-based. I began my TV career at Granada in Manchester, and I always thought that one reason World in Action was so good was that actually it was based in Salford. And I know Channel 4 and Channel 4 News are opening their big office in Leeds, and we need to see people get out much more, and we need to be employing some very different people. No offense meant, Nick, but there are a lot of people who have lovely degrees in politics from Oxford, and I think, oh yes, that would be you. And I think that we need some more people who were brought up and educated in different sorts of institutions and live in different places now. I mean, you live in London now, you don't come from there. I live in London now, I don't come from London. We need the people who report to be remaining in those towns and cities. I was forced to move to London to move up in my career. I didn't want to do that. And we need to create careers at the highest levels in journalism for people in the towns and cities across the United Kingdom while we still have a United Kingdom.
Well, as it happens, I agree with that. And I gave a rather less distinguished lecture than yours, but the Steve Hewlett lecture, in which I said that there ought to be more concern with the social class and background. Fewer people like me, middle-aged, white, prosperous guys who got PPE degrees from Oxford. So I agree with you on that. I want to bring in Deborah now in her own right, because Deborah, you've written a chapter in this book drawing on your perspective as someone who understands Italy.
I have, Nick, but
Britain,
before I go into that, Nick, if you'll allow me, I just wanted to say that I think it's happening now again with the Indie Ref 2 and independence and all the coverage of Scotland's sort of desire for independence and how this would be fantastic and how the EU can't wait to embrace Scotland out of the Union. And so many things are being lied about and so many things are being glossed over that need proper debate. And I just wonder whether we're going towards another moment like Brexit, where Scotland will cut itself off from the United Kingdom on what I think and many of my colleagues think are completely the wrong premises. So it would be interesting to see.
Deborah, just before you move on, because this is a seminar about a book and it's about the nature of journalism, what is the failing in journalism, rather than the failure of the idea, which is a political point? What is the failure in journalism that you think means that debate isn't being had?
I think that the potential failure is that we don't seem to have learnt much from the Brexit lesson. What went wrong with the reporting of lies and false constructs in that particular referendum seems to be happening again now, and I think that we need a lot more. We saw this before the elections in Scotland when it was all a lot of marvel at how the pro-independence parties were gaining gaining seats and gaining importance, and how the debate was being covered mainly from that point of view. But how many were discussing what happens with the currency, what happens with the fact that Scotland doesn't have the numbers to join the EU, what happens with all the incongruencies that are there just waiting to be exposed, but I don't think that they're being talked about enough. And I think foreign reporting on this again is different to domestic reporting on.
Different in that sense, you think better?
No, just less emotional. I'm sorry that being Italian, I think that, I shouldn't ever say that, but I think less emotional than the way the Brits are seeing this. And just based on fact. Maybe it's because the Europeans in particular, in terms of journalists here, so that's, as far as I will, push myself, but, European journalists here are still hurt maybe by what happened with Brexit and are therefore slightly more alert to a similar fate happening with Scotland.
Well, I do want to bring you back with your overview of the fact that Brits didn't understand the origins of the European idea. But let me go to Robert and also to Dorothy, just to reflect on what you've just said. It seems to me, Robert, that's what's being said was said about the American media 25 years ago when I first went. God, it was probably longer ago than that, actually. But also the British media, which is crudely, we do the horse race too much. We don't do ideas. We don't do debates. It's politician A says this, politician B says that, chop it together, have a bit of a row. We're suckers for charismatic personalities. In America, that's Donald Trump. In the UK, it was Alex Salmond or it was Nigel Farage. And we call that journalism. And I think that myself is as much a problem as many of the powerful critiques that Dorothy has made of political journalism. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree, Nick, and I think you're right. It's our preoccupation with the sort of the latest, shiniest object that we think can get more viewers. And as I say, I mean, it's the absence of understanding the kind of core issues that impacted kind of ordinary Americans that helped to fuel the kind of the rise of Trump, but also this sense in America that the mainstream media, for lack of a better word, can't be trusted. And that's what has in turn led to millions of Americans turning to kind of right-wing talk radio, to new right-wing cable stations like OAN, and also, of course, to the online conspiracy theories and chat platforms that is now dominating the debate. And I think that's where we are now, is this sense that and I saw it for myself on January 6th, to keep bringing you back to that prism, is how there is now conspiracy theories absolutely at the heart of the political debate here. It's an astonishing fact that over half of Republicans, this is tens of millions of Americans, believe that January the 6th was itself a conspiracy theory. In other words, that many Americans believe that January the 6th was a left-wing kind of false flag operation designed to discredit conservatives. So, it isn't just that January the 6th was born out of a conspiracy theory, namely that the election was stolen. It spawned an entirely new conspiracy theory. And I saw that for myself on the day. And as I've gone back to interview insurrectionists who I was with, I realized that actually, the depth of this of these conspiracy theories is driven in a way by these social media algorithms, and that's an additional journalistic problem. So in a way, we've got the perfect storm here, haven't we? We've got there's a distrust in the conventional mainstream television cable news stations, and we understand why that is, because they're not talking about issues. Rather, they are talking about issues. They're not news gathering. And then we've got people gathering news from really toxic online platforms. So it's a double challenge, if you like, for how we're going to navigate the next big populist challenge.
Yeah. Dorothy, a reflection on that, if you would, before I bring back Deborah to do that. I suppose my core point is that if, and I know you don't argue this, by the way, but it seems to me there is a danger in thinking the way you deal with populism is you brand it as untrue, and you have a row about that, which seems to me to play into the hands of the populists. They want an argument about whether it's 350 million or 150 million. They want an argument about whether it is a wall or it isn't a wall that's being built. That's precisely what they want to do.
I think that is why you have to go for in-depth analysis and not for treating these big political issues as if they're horse races. I think the other thing that we can learn from the US is that it's very important that we maintain public trust in the media. We know that actually at the beginning of COVID, levels of public trust in television were extremely high. And there are bad populists, if I may say, who try to put forward the false view in this country that the British people don't trust the mainstream media. They want people to believe that they don't believe in TV. And actually, British people do believe in television news, which overwhelmingly, although I'm sometimes critical of it, is truthful and fair and accurate because it's regulated. And we mustn't play into the hands of people who want to undermine public trust in the media.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, let me bring Deborah Bonetti back now, because Deborah, I want to go to what you discuss in this book, and in particular, whether, talking as someone with Italian roots, whether the Brits ever really understood and ever really explained journalistically the European idea. Far
My
away.
chapter was quite a light-hearted love letter in a way to the Brits. You know, after Brexit, so many things got broken, and there is an argument to say that, you know, was Britain ever really part of the EU, as in the European ideals? Do we really share all that much, all these values, or not? And I think, of course, we do. Of course, you know, we have so many things in common, but also we have so many things that are not in common. And I do think that still now there is a little bit of unrequited love coming from Europe towards Britain, and not really being requited. And so, yes, what I wrote was quite a light-hearted view of that, being a dual national, having lived practically exactly half of my life here and half of my life in Italy. And I do think that we've got so many things that bring us together. It's such a shame that Brexit happened. It's okay that it did. We need to move on. Does that make the you know, the United Kingdom slightly less European? No, it doesn't. Not really. But I do think that it has some major differences with the continentals, as you like to call us.
The challenge,
And
though, if I may, Deborah, the challenge for this discussion is the media bit, which is what lessons do you learn about the media's lack either of interest in or ability to explain and understand European thinking, which arguably is an even bigger point. I mean, for example, you know, I'm very conscious at the BBC that we do enormous amount of coverage of what's happening in Iowa and extraordinarily little coverage about what's happening in Berlin. And I'm pretty damn clear which one's more important.
that is exactly true. And there is an insularity, and that is fine. A lot of islands are insular by definition. That is fine. But it tends to be true that when people here, media here, think of foreign media, it's automatically either the Commonwealth or the US. Very, very few look over to what happens in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal. There is very little trade in terms of, not trade by trade exactly, if you forgive me the word, it's just exchange of cultural ideas. And do the Brits read a lot of authors that come from you know, one of these countries that I just quoted? No. This is very normal. If you live in Italy, you are absolutely kind of aware of what's happening in all, you know, if we're talking about books, if we're talking about major shows, if we're talking about whatever, we all know what's going on around us in Austria, in Croatia, whatever. Here, it's almost impossible unless somebody is an incredible success story like Elena Ferrante with her, you know, Special Friends series and all that, to come
Okay.
across.
I want to use our last few minutes just to reflect on where we are. This is about a book. We're very keen that you buy the book. But if you're interested in a book like this, you'll be interested in developments in the media. GB News has launched, and I can't wait to just hear. Robert, I suspect you've not had a chance to watch it. But GB News is a big new potential player on the British scene. It's the sort of thing that I imagine will be in the next book of this sort. Just a brief thought from you on whether, in a sense, you welcome the competition, you welcome a new player, or whether you worry that it is an American style development. And then I'll bring Dorothy.
You asking me, Nick?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what I would urge, I won't pass judgment on GB News because I haven't seen it other than a few sort of clips. And, you know, we wish it well. I mean, you know, anything that's new and fresh is welcome competition. But I would urge anybody assessing the, you know, the direction of travel for British television news to come over here and to watch MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News in the prime time hours, and not be deeply alarmed about even now what is going on. You know, and I'm not just talking about the sort of the Fox News right-wing agenda. I'm also talking about how CNN in the prime time hours will, without question, describe the insurrectionists of January the 6th as domestic terrorists. No question asked. There's no debate about that. They are just branded as domestic terrorists on certain shows in CNN, when I actually think it's a much more nuanced view than that, and that many of them are actually, conspiracy theorists, not terrorists. So I just would urge anybody looking at GB News to come here and realise what the danger is of opinion masquerading as news.
I think Dorothy would be fascinated by your view that what's most striking about GB News in a way is not its Fox-like opinions, but the fact that, as Robert started this conversation with, there is absolutely no investment in news gathering. It is all about talk.
Yeah, and I think what the British people really need is properly resourced television news, real news gathering, not a whole load of blokes sitting about. I mean, I wish them luck, but I couldn't help noticing that one of the first things that happened was it Dan Wooten said, we're not here to hector, and then he hectored me for ages. What I want is properly resourced news, and I think, good luck to them, but at the same time, we should be aware that there is a threat looming with the potential privatization of Channel 4 to television news gathering of a very high quality. If Channel 4 is privatized, I am concerned that brilliant 1 hour of primetime news and fantastic programs like Unreported World and big expensive documentaries like For Sama will be threatened.
Dorothy, thank you very much indeed. In fact, I'm going to thank all of our contributors because it's been a fascinating hour. Dorothy, Deborah, Robert, earlier, Matt, Frei, and of course, John Curtice as well. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. And it just remains for me to say thank you for watching, for listening, for taking part, because I've seen the comments that have been coming up on the right-hand side. Let's remember what we're promoting. Maybe we could even put up a picture of it. There we are, Populism, the Pandemic and the Media. And you can see the editors there at the bottom, John Mair, Tor Clark, Neil Fowler, Raymond, Snoddy and Richard Tait. Is available, or it will be soon, on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. And the ebook will soon be available worldwide through Routledge. And I'm, in the way of these things, asked to tell you something I can barely understand, but I'm going to do it. Still to come in Jericho, Oxford, apparently. The second book fair next Sunday, the 27th, in Mount Place by Canal Bridge. You're all welcome if you're there. And next Wednesday, the 30th, on my virtual Jericho at 5:30 on YouTube, local historian Mark Davis talks about Alice in Wonderland and Jericho. More details, I'm told, at myjericho.co.uk. A fresh delight each and every week. Just remains for me to say, forgive the shabby study that I've ended up in. Thank you very much for taking part. Enjoy the book and keep contributing to the debate about the nature of our journalism. As you've just heard from people who have given their lives to it, it sure does matter.
Yeah.